Three, two, one, zero.
Hello and welcome back to Ground Control, talking all things space and really above the atmosphere. I'm meteorologist Andrew Brightman, really excited for a great conversation here about going farther and faster through space, and have a really special guest with me today. I have Dr. Harold Sonny White, a mechanical engineer and aerospace engineer. A very long CV in terms of how do we get farther and faster through space. So first off, Dr. White, I'll call you Sonny for the rest of the interview.
Don't call me. Yeah, no need to call me Doctor.
How are you doing today? First off, my first question: How did you get the nickname Sonny?
Right, Andrew. It's great to chat with you today. I imagine the weather is probably a little cooler up there in North Carolina than it is here in Houston, so we're quite a bit jealous of you're getting a little bit of a jump start on fall from us. Yeah, so the nickname Sonny. My dad was in Vietnam when I was born, and so Harold Glenn White Jr. is like the full legal name, but I got Sonny as the nickname because my disposition, I suppose. Although I have to admit, I did an interview on a podcast the other day, and the title was interview with Harold Sonny White, and some of the comments were like, I thought I was going to be listening to a gangster, right? Who knew, right? So
You're an engineering and space gangster, Sonny. So let's talk a little bit about your background here. You've got a degree in mechanical engineering from the University of South Alabama. We also have a master's degree from Wichita State, a PhD in physics from Rice University. What really kind of drew you to kind of a passion here for engineering, and specifically engineering when it comes to going farther and faster in outer space?
yeah, Andrew, I think I've always known from a very early age that I was going to be in a technical domain somewhere. I grew up in Washington, D.C., and so I got to spend a lot of time in the National Air and Space Smithsonian. And so that had a pretty big impact on me as a young kid. The National Air and Space Smithsonian is full of all kinds of aircraft and spaceships and rockets, and it's quite amazing to behold some of these things. And it's not, it's when you walk around in a place like that, it's not just about the things you're looking at. When you kind of look at the stories behind the things, those types of stories of people working together was really compelling to me. And so I think that really influenced the course that I took, starting off getting my bachelor's in mechanical engineering. I started working with Boeing up in Wichita, Kansas in 1996. I got my master's at Wichita State while I was up there. Always had a very strong interest in advanced power and propulsion, and so that kind of influenced my switch from mechanical engineering to physics, and so ended up getting my PhD in physics from Rice University while I was working for NASA, supporting human spaceflight. I guess my favorite color is yellow, and my lucky number is pi. So now you know something more personal about me.
No, I actually, funny that you say that. When I was in 8th grade, I memorized pi to 505 places. So,
Oh my gosh, that's awesome.
I got a good. You talked about me being a space nerd when we talked earlier, so you can tell I'm a kind of a nerd in many respects. You're saying, but I really,
I love it.
yeah, absolutely. And talking about that, our similar interests here in going through space. And one thing when we talk about advanced power and propulsion, there's a big difference between getting to space versus going through space. And could you kind of talk about the differences and the challenge that each kind of represent as we try to venture a little bit farther?
Yeah, Andrew, we definitely live in a day and age where we are mastering the art of getting to space. We see that with a lot of the companies that are busy perfecting rockets that help us climb against the gravitational well and put payloads into low Earth orbit. You've got SpaceX, Blue Origin. You've got some of the legacy companies. You have a number of other companies that are just starting up. all of which are bringing a lot of these amazing capabilities online to help us get payloads into low Earth orbit or get payloads from the surface of the Earth to space. And so when you get into space and you're trying to move to different locations, now Earth to Moon is one thing that's a little bit more forgiving, but Earth to Mars is where you're really starting to increase, let's call it just the energy penalty that you have to pay to be able to move from Earth to another location. And certainly if you think about places beyond Mars in the solar system, for example, the amount of energy that's necessary for those types of destinations gets really, really large. And so that's just a quick preamble to say the following. The optimization of systems to get to space is very different from the optimization of systems to move through space. They're very different problems in terms of the amount of energy that's involved. To get to space from the surface of the Earth, the amount of energy that you have to put into a payload is about 9.4 kilometers a second. That's the equivalent kinetic energy, if you will, that it takes to get some payload from the surface of the Earth into low Earth orbit. And so in order to do that, you have to have a system that can provide enough thrust to lift the whole rocket and that payload against the pull of gravity. And so that particular problem kind of demands that you make use of the things that we call chemical propulsion. When you talk about space travel, people typically have a mental picture of a long pencil-shaped thing that has a payload at the end of it and makes a lot of smoke and noise, and it's really cool. But once you get into low Earth orbit, you can use very different approaches. You no longer have to have a thrust-to-weight ratio greater than 1. You can actually have a thrust-to-weight ratio much less than 1. And so let me illustrate this. We've all gone on a boating trip with some friends at the lake where we get on a boat from a dock, and oftentimes in the process of stepping off the dock onto a boat, you might grab the railing that's on the boat in your process of stepping onto the boat. And you might notice you can move the whole boat with just the strength that you have in your arm, right? Even though the boat weighs a couple thousand pounds, you still have enough capability to move it side to side. That's because in a two-dimensional sense, that's effectively equivalent to 0G. This is kind of why we train astronauts in the neutral buoyancy lab, the great big giant swimming pool, if you will. It's a way to get as close to 0G in 3 dimensions as you possibly can. So when you're in low Earth orbit, you don't have to lift your whole vehicle against the pull of gravity. You can actually use rocket propulsion systems that have much lower thrust, but they're much more fuel efficient. So in the process of converting some amount of propellant into kinetic energy, chemical propulsion has a certain level of efficiency, and then the types of systems that we can use when we get into space can help us achieve much higher efficiencies. Things like electric propulsion. So instead of using chemical propulsion, where you combine a fuel and an oxidizer, and the specific heat of combustion puts the kinetic energy in the combustion products, and that's what goes out the back of the nozzle. Instead of using that for the energy generation process, we can use electric and magnetic fields to strip electrons off of a propellant gas and accelerate that with electric and magnetic fields to much higher velocities. And so that ends up being much more efficient. And so I'll finish with this. And so, for example, why this might be really important, if we ever want to send human beings past Mars in the solar system, in time frames that kind of trace to the time frames we've thought about for Mars, like a 200-day transit.
Yeah.
We wanted to get a human crew from Earth to the Saturn system in 200 days. The amount of energy is 10 times higher than the amount of energy it takes to get a payload from the surface of the Earth to low Earth orbit.
Wow.
So through space, is very, very different from two space. Two space has a certain set of boundary conditions, and it gets optimized when we see a chemical propulsion rocket, whereas through space, it's a very different set of solutions that we bring to the table that allow us to do that. And that becomes more pronounced the further out we get in the solar system. So I got really technical there. So Andrew,
No,
since
that was
yeah.
no. I think it was very relatively easy to grasp there, and we're going to talk more about kind of going through space and some of the different technologies that you've talked about here coming up right after the break. We're going to be right back with ground control with Dr. Harold Sonny White here in a moment. Welcome back to Ground Control. I'm meteorologist Andrew Brightman with Dr. Harold Sonny White. Sonny, we're talking more about going through space here, and you were talking about, a 200-day trip, and that's just right now with chemical propulsion going to Mars. For me personally, I mean, I thought people would want to get to, we talk about trying to build a colony on Mars, to a 200-day trip is a really long trip. We're basically going back to where we were in the 17th century in terms of transit trips going across oceans here, and then going farther, it's just not really feasible. I think a great way to think about this when you talk about getting to space and through space, the advantage, the technologies of getting to space dramatically, exponentially decline in efficiency and usability the farther you go out in the solar system, right?
And it's not just that, Andrew. It's the distance and the time frame that you want to take to get there, right? So that Saturn mission is a great illustration of that combination of two constraints. Saturn it's about 10 astronomical units from the sun. That's an astronomical unit is like the distance. Excuse me, is like the distance from the sun to the Earth. And if you were to use that as a unit of measure, that's an astronomical unit. So 10 of those is the distance to Saturn. And so if we wanted to get humans to Saturn in 200 days, that's about 150 kilometers a second delta V. That's the amount of energy that we have to put in. And that is over 10x more energy than it takes to get a payload from the surface of the Earth to low Earth orbit. So let's take your challenge. We want to get a human crew to Mars. And instead of doing the 200 days, we want to do it in a much shorter period of time. So now you're pulling that other variable into the discussion, right? So, Mars is considerably closer. However, you're saying, well, let's make it much quicker than 200 days.
Let's do 20 days.
Right. If you want to get there in 20 days, well, that's going to drive the delta V that's necessary to do that up significantly, right? And so when you impose those kinds of requirements, the delta V, the energy that's necessary to achieve it, goes up significantly. And then when you calculate how much propellant you need to do that, you rapidly find out, chemical propulsion with the types of efficiencies that it can achieve, right? It's just your system blows up. You have all this propellant mass and a wee little tiny payload. Just a quick, interesting piece of history going back to pre-NASA. In 1956, 1957, Werner von Braun worked with Walt Disney to produce a couple of episodes for Disneyland, thematically related to Tomorrowland, right? One of the sections of the park. And so one of those episodes was Mars and Beyond. And as part of sharing that vision, now this is in 1957. You can actually go to YouTube and Google this. The architecture that von Braun and his team was envisioning for a human mission to Mars was something based on nuclear electric propulsion, where you've got a nuclear reactor, just like you might find here on the surface of the planet, coupled to some form of electric propulsion. You heard me kind of talk about that before. This is where you ionize the propellant and you accelerate that using electrostatic and electromagnetic fields. And then that gives you a very, very fuel efficient architecture to get somewhere. And so the entire architecture in 1957, before NASA was even created, was a nuclear electric propulsion mission architecture. So they knew even then that through space is very different than to space.
Yeah, and let's talk a little. The first, there's three different kind of segments of this we'll talk about. The first one, which is the most feasible, we know both the physics and the engineering behind this, as you were just talking about, nuclear electric propulsion. Basically, how fast could we theoretically go with that type of propulsion? And then it's kind of a two-parter here. My second question is, why aren't we thinking about utilizing that for Mars? Because again, a 200-day trip in outer space, there's a lot of things that can go wrong. It's very difficult if someone catastrophically run to rescue someone. These are long periods of time. That's only just during the transit. So my question is, how fast could we go? And then what's stopping us from really using that type of technology right now?
Right, Andrew. So, as a capability, nuclear electric propulsion, it's based on known physics, known engineering. And so, in my role at NASA, right, when I was supporting the human architecture teams, right, you've got a little bag of tricks. And in my case, I was a power and prop guy, and so you'd reach in and grab some things out, and we'd pull together some concepts to try and figure out what the next chapter of human spaceflight might be. And if we had a nuclear electric propulsion architecture capability that existed, um, if that existed today, that enables us to send human beings to every destination in the solar system. It allows us to get human beings past Mars to the outer planets, to moons of the outer planets. So it's as a capability, it is definitely enabling. It's not just enhancing.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, yes, we've sent probes to the outer planets in the solar system, but going back to that time distance thing, the time it takes to get the spacecraft there is very long, right? If you think about the spacecraft we sent to Pluto, it took quite a long time to get there, and that was even working really hard to get it going as fast as we could get it to go. So nuclear electric propulsion, known physics, known engineering, allows us to do a lot of things that we couldn't do otherwise. One of the reasons we don't currently have it is all the missions that we've been predominantly focused on for the last several decades, building the International Space Station, flying the space shuttle, have all been something that we could execute quite capably just using chemical propulsion. So we didn't need it. There wasn't some kind of mission pull that elevated the resources necessary to be able to bring something like that to bear. Now, in the process of sending human beings back to the surface of the moon and looking at establishing a presence on Mars, you're seeing some programs for what we would call fission surface power, right? So we know that the nights on the moon are quite long, a little over 2 weeks, and so you have to have some kind of power source that can operate when it's really cold and there's no light. And so that provides an opportunity for us to, as a nation, to put some municipal resources into developing a fission surface power system. And so I think that capability will come first. And then after we get that for surface power, we'll adapt it for use in space as well. When you think about human beings on a spacecraft that makes use of nuclear electric propulsion, for surface power, we can get by with tens of kilowatts to 100 kilowatts. But if we're using it as part of the power and propulsion architecture to, ionize and accelerate a gas, you're talking megawatts. And so megawatts electric. And so just to give the listeners an idea of what a megawatt electric is, when you've sat at a railroad track and you've watched locomotives go by, each locomotive, in terms of the diesel engines, they're turning electric generators that then provide electricity to the wheels to turn them. They're roughly between 2 to 5 megawatts of electrical power. So that's kind of, when you think of a megawatt, that's a good mental reference.
Okay, gotcha. And so just to wrap up this segment here, how current chemical propulsion, I'm just eyeballing here, roughly we can go about 25 to 30,000 miles an hour. With potential a nuclear electric propulsion system, what is sort of the theoretical max speed that we could see with that type of system?
Well, so for nuclear electric propulsion, it all comes down to, because the speed you're talking about, right? The speed that a propulsion system is able to produce for some kind of a system is related to how quick this stuff comes out the back of the rocket, whatever it may be. And so you just kind of hit on one of the reasons why chemical propulsion, it can only do so much, because that exhaust speed is only so fast. So you can only put so much energy into the payload. Nuclear electric propulsion as a capability allows us to go much faster than chemical propulsion. If you were to let's put a limit to it, right? So
Okay.
yes, it gets to every destination in the solar system, but some listeners might ask, hey, what about interstellar? I always see these TV shows talking about interstellar. What about that? Nuclear electric propulsion has a capability, really only allows us to get to another star system in a couple thousand years. So although it's very useful in the solar system, it's not as effective for interstellar. And so for that, we need to switch to something else to go even faster.
Gotcha. And we're going to talk about going even faster than that coming up here in a moment with our next segment with Dr. Harold Sonny White. We'll be right back with Ground Control. I'm Andrew Brightman. We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back to Ground Control. I'm meteorologist Andrew Brightman with Dr. Harold Sonny White. Here we're talking about going really far, really fast. How do we go to another star system? I always see in movies here, it's like a deus ex machina, where it's just, they just figured out how to go unbelievable distance. We're talking tens of trillions of miles here in a relatively normal amount of time. So let's talk about how we would actually make something like that work. There's fusion power, where if we somehow could figure out the engineering, I think I've seen studies we could go maybe 5% of the speed of light, which is incredibly fast. That's roughly about, I think it's like 67 million miles an hour. But no, that still won't work for going if we want to go to another star system and maybe come back in a human lifetime. So what you are known for here in the Space Nerd Interweb, which I consider myself one of them, is building a space warp to do theoretical faster than light travel. How does that work conceptually without violating the laws of relativity, the theory of relativity?
Yeah, Andrew, a great question. Yes, fusion, propulsion, known physics, not known engineering allows us to get to 5% the speed of light. But what if we want to get to another star system in a fraction of a human lifetime? We have to be mindful of what I call the 11th commandment of physics: thou shalt not exceed the speed of light. The same mathematical framework that establishes this speed limit provides us with a couple of loopholes. And they're centered on the premise that space can expand and contract at any speed. And we know this is part of nature because we see it when we look at the beginning of the cosmos. Right after the Big Bang, about 14 billion years ago, there was an inflationary phase where points in the universe moved away from one another with exceedingly high velocities, like 10 to the 30th times the speed of light. So nearly instantaneous for all intents and purposes. And so we know nature can do that. And so an operative question that physicists have been talking about in the literature for quite some time is, if nature can do it, can we potentially do it? And so there was a physicist in 1994 that wrote down some mathematical models that encapsulated this idea in physical form. And when you kind of take the mathematics and map it to physical form, you end up with a spaceship that kind of looks like some kind of a central portion where a crew might be, surrounded by some kind of equatorial ring that has to be filled with something called negative vacuum energy density. And so this physical embodiment, for the interested viewer, you could probably just Google IXS Enterprise and see a wonderful rendition of what this looks like in physical form. But the idea of a space warp is that you expand and contract space in such a way that you can make it look like you're going to another star system at much higher speeds than the speed of light. You can make it look like you could go to Alpha Centauri at 10 times the speed of light effectively, if you will, as measured by crew on the spacecraft and as measured by folks in mission control or ground control, right? So, Andrew, you'd be logging that exact same time that the crew folks would see. A good illustration of the idea of a space warp. We can finish with this. When we go to airports and we're moving around between gates, airports routinely make use of those little horizontal conveyor belts, kind of help you move more quickly between gates. And most of us, when we get onto those travelators with our bags or something like that, we don't stop. We continue to walk at our normal speed. Now, let's think for a second. what happens or what it looks like to somebody that's sitting on a chair watching you as you're going on your journey. When you're not on the travelator, it looks like you're moving at about 3 miles an hour. When you step onto the travelator, all of a sudden it looks like you're moving at 6 miles an hour. So what's going on here? Think about that belt that you just stepped onto. What's happening to the length of belt in front of you, right? The length of belt in front of you it's kind of contracting. Technically, it's looping underneath. This is a metaphor.
Yeah.
But the belt is contracting. And what's happening to the length of the belt behind you? It's expanding. It's rotating underneath. This is a metaphor. But the manifold is expanding and contracting in such a way so that it looks like to both you and an external observer that you're going much faster than you were without the use of that apparatus. So, Andrew, I challenge you, the next time you go to an airport, being very minded about this stuff as you are, and you put your hand on one of those little railings that the travelator to go on your way, I want you to just secretly whisper to yourself, engage, right?
Sonny, I will do that when I fly out of Charlotte Douglas here to go see some family for Thanksgiving. So that's all we have time for today. I really appreciate your time, Sonny, Dr. White. I always got to crown you with the PhD. Anyway, I really appreciate your time here talking about how do we go farther and faster in some of the technologies that we're going to need in order to do that. So that's going to do it here for this episode of Ground Control. I'm meteorologist Andrew Brightman. Thank you so much for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.
Queen City News Plus. Just search Queen City News on your smart TV's app store.